Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Christopher Wyeth, a staff lecturer here in the Education Department of the National Gallery of Art. And joining me this evening are two special guests. One of them, I'm sure, needs no introduction. He is George Manos, assistant to the director for music and the conductor of the National Gallery Orchestra. The other one does need a little introduction, and I'm very delighted to provide it. The individual is Emerson Meyers, whose music is certainly known to everybody tonight, somebody who is being celebrated this evening for his 75th birthday. However, he has assured me that tonight, this Sunday, is not his birthday. Nevertheless, we are going to celebrate it tonight. And before we begin, gentlemen, can I welcome you both here this evening?
Thank you, Chris.
Certainly, thank you.
I know, as I mentioned, Mr. Meyers, that everybody will know you tonight, at least from your music. I wonder if you could say a few words about your background, because as I understand it, you certainly are no known quantity here in Washington.
My background was that of a piano player, a student, and I started quite young. Of course, I'm a native of Washington. My wife is a native of Washington. My mother was a native of Washington, and my father was a native of Washington. And I was born in a house at 1222 29th Street in Georgetown. Boy. And it still exists. And I spent most of my life in Washington, outside the 2 or 3 years that I spent the winters in Belgium. I won a 3-year alumni scholarship to attend the Peabody Conservatory in Baltimore, and I received an artist diploma from there in piano. I had a wonderful piano teacher who was also George's piano teacher at one time. And he had one objective, it seemed to me, and that was he would say, Emerson, you're no composer. Composers are people who compose all day long, every day, and you don't do that. That was his reasoning. But despite that, the first piece on tonight's program is dedicated to him.
He told me the same thing, Emerson.
Maybe this is an evening of revenge, I don't know.
Yeah. No revenge.
You
no
didn't
revenge.
disappoint him in either area, I'm afraid.
So, one interesting story is that around the house there was an old violin that belonged to my uncle. And I used to get it out of the case and make noises on it, whereupon they decided that I should also study the violin, which I don't regret. But when I won this scholarship to the Peabody, my father took me for a walk. And he said, Emerson, are you sure you want to take this scholarship? It seems to me you should stay with the violin. It's a much more manly instrument. I didn't agree. And during the course of my life, I have played horns in bands and was a church organist for many years, choir director, and all this kind of thing. There's very little I haven't done in the field of music. But I do like to write, and I like to compose. But I only like to compose what I like to compose, you know. I don't arrange other people's music very well. I don't like to. I've also worked in theater, mainly at Albany Theater, where I did a lot of background music for plays, and I'm rather proud of what I did for a show, the Glass Menagerie. That music, that background music, I really thought hit the spot.
I must point out, Christopher, that Emerson's music has been played on both sides of the pond.
Yes.
And, of course, he's written many major works. One in particular that I remember about was the full-length opera that he wrote for in B.C., wasn't it, Emerson?
Yeah. Yep. That is not one that I prize because of it's too short. I had a libretto given to me, thrust upon me, and it was 25 or 30 pages to be compressed into a half-hour TV segment.
Oh, boy.
And a lot of characters. So I went to the author of this libretto. I said, this won't work. I'm cutting out this scene, this scene, this scene, and these characters. And finally got it down to 4 people and a chorus that walks across stage at the beginning and walks off the stage at the end. And the thing is so tight to get some of the story in.
Maybe it'll be done again someday in its full length.
Well, it's so tight, George, that There's not even enough time for the music to speak to let somebody walk across the stage. They're yakking all the time.
Well, I wonder if I could ask both of you, since you are composers, despite what maybe your music teacher might have thought at one time, what is the greatest satisfaction as a composer?
You want to try that one, Emerson?
You go first.
Well, I would say two satisfactions that go hand in hand. One is to think that you've written something good once it's finished, and secondly, to have it performed and accepted.
Yeah.
I think you could add on to that.
I'm not
much more eloquently.
That's essentially it.
Yeah.
Hearing it the first time and finding out that it comes out the way you thought it would.
Yeah, seeing your baby come to life, so
sure.
to speak. Yeah.
As another bond, I suppose, that you two share is that the fact you're both American music composers. And I wonder if either one of you have some thoughts on American music and its position in this country and in the world in general.
If you're talking about music today, being written today, it has very little position in this country, American music or foreign, if it's really of the newer genre of composition. People like what they know, and they're not in the mood to be changed. I'm talking about the great majority of audience. There was a time when new things were accepted in this country, and I'm talking about the 30s, when the Philadelphia Orchestra and all the big orchestras were doing the latest things. They don't do it today. They're playing what the public wants because it brings in box office.
And pays the bills.
And subsidies don't seem to help because, again, the subsidies not enough to do any of the newer things, which are being done in Europe quite a bit, but not here.
The composers and the media that performs their music are more active in Europe than they are here.
Much more, surely.
Yeah.
But you talk about American music. I don't know how you would define it, the characteristics when you come to a technical standpoint. If you're talking about general tonal handling, it might be the ambivalent handling of the seventh note of the scale. We had a debate on that once at school among the faculty concerned with composition. By school, I'm talking about when I was a professor at Catholic University. And we tried to find out what's American in American music, and we had an awful time, and that's the only conclusion we could come to. Mm-hmm. But speaking of American music, there's an interesting story about Edward MacDowell. Notice how I say MacDowell, I don't say McDowell.
Yeah.
Because I had a long conversation with his widow at the colony up there in New Hampshire. And she said he insisted on being known as MacDowell. And she further said he would never permit his music to be played on a program of, quote, American music. He said, I want my music to stand up with any music anywhere else, and so don't just call me an American composer.
Well, we were just talking about that very kind of thing in a few weeks past with Richard Bales and Paul Hume, that some of the great works in America, especially symphonic works, and for that matter, even piano sonatas, shorter works, they're good enough to substitute let's say, a Dvorak symphony for an American symphony. You know, it's worth it to substitute a Beethoven sonata, you see, for either a Copland sonata or a Session sonata or a Barber or a Rockberg or what have you. We have to do it, really. We have to hear this music. Mm-hmm. We have to hear it. And I think it's gotten to the point where there really isn't any excuse anymore. Yeah. You know, one should do it. American artists should do it, really. Should substitute some Beethoven and Brahms and what have you for American composers. It's the only way we'll have our music heard, you see. And that's what we're trying to do, especially every year at the gallery with the American Music Festival, you see.
Yeah, that was just what I was going to mention, the fact that if it is so difficult to get the music played, then these kinds of things here at the gallery where the box office and financial income do not play a role, gives you the chance to try many new things.
The sad thing is that we're only, a festival for 2 months, 8 weeks, and that means 8 slots. And we don't have enough time, space, money to take care of every composer who really wants to be represented here, you see.
Well, especially in the symphonic repertoire, that's very expensive.
It's very expensive because we have to rehearse 2 or 3, 4 times as long to get a new work together.
Yeah, sure.
You can put a Mozart or maybe an early Beethoven symphony together quickly, but not an avant-garde symphony or a new symphony.
It doesn't have to be avant-garde.
Yeah, it takes time. Anything new takes time to rehearse, and that takes money.
Adding on to that, is it hard today for a composer to get his pieces performed?
Very.
Very difficult.
Very. Very difficult.
Because of these reasons, you see.
Yeah.
In other words, at the gallery here, we only have really one big rehearsal with the orchestra on Saturday. Sunday morning's rehearsal is merely a run-through. We haven't really got time to stop and take apart and do this kind of thing. But this applies even in instrumental music. I mean, anything other than orchestra. Well, even with Emerson Meyers here, I can say quite openly, I had the pleasure of doing a world premiere. It was the your Kindler Foundation commission, and he wrote a very exciting rhapsody for piano solo, and I have to, and I'll say it here, right in front of Emerson Meyers and the audience. I love playing it, but I worked like a devil for about 3 or 4 months before I could play that. If it was Beethoven or Chopin, I could have learned it in a week's time, but this was so difficult. Yeah, but of course, when it was finished, you had a great feeling of satisfaction that, by golly, I climbed a mountain, you see. Very difficult to do. But at that time, my own piano in my own home, and of course, I was also teaching at the university. I could sneak practice time between students, you see. But I really had to work hard. The music today is frightfully difficult, yeah, and soul-satisfying at the same time. But it takes time. Now, you can't do that with an orchestra.
Yeah.
You can't do that with an orchestra. A string quartet could probably do it. They get together on their own time. They can do this, that, and the other thing. But when you're dealing with orchestra members and union and a time slot, your book ended, you can't do it. Consequently, we have to, and Emerson will hold up with me on this, we have to say no to some very fine composers who've written some very fine music because there just isn't time to do it, really.
Mm-hmm. I had an experience with Hans Kindler. I was a conductor of the symphony here, and he was a cellist, and he asked me to do a concert with him as pianist in Chambersburg, Pennsylvania. Never forget it. And he played a sonata, an old one. I cannot remember it was Haydn or Handel. But at any rate, there was one place he said, now, I'm going to play very freely here. You keep strict time, and I'm going to do a rubato over 2 bars. And you keep strict time, and I'm going to do my rubato work here, and we'll come out together at this beat. Well, it was very difficult for me. I was going to follow him as I've been trained. But, we did come out together at that beat where he said we would.
Brings me perhaps to the last thing I might want to ask you, Mr. Meyers, and that is if you have any thoughts as we draw to a conclusion about some of the pieces that are being performed tonight, some words you'd like to impart to the listeners about the particular works.
I'm going to say what I heard Stockhausen tell an audience at the Peabody years ago when they were experiencing electronic music for the first time. He said, don't try to analyze, just sit back and let the sounds wash over you.
And now, back to our announcer.